The battlefield was a nightmare. Explosions shook the ground, smoke filled the sky, and the cries of wounded soldiers echoed through the chaos. Dust and blood mixed together, turning the once green fields into a sea of red and gray. Men ran in every direction, some carrying their fallen comrades, others seeking cover. The war had been raging for years, and yet the fighting showed no sign of stopping. Inside a small, makeshift field hospital, the scene was just as desperate. Doctors and nurses moved frantically between the rows of wounded men. Blood stained the white sheets in the walls, and the smell of antiseptic barely masked the metallic tang in the air. Every day the hospital was filled with soldiers who had lost too much blood to survive. They tried everything: transfusions, new medicines, and bandages, but no matter what they did, the number of deaths kept rising. In the middle of the chaos, one man stood apart. Dr. Victor Harlan, a quiet, serious man with deep-set eyes and a sharp mind, watched the suffering around him. Unlike others, he did not panic or shout. He moved carefully, examining each patient, thinking quickly. He had a calm confidence, the kind that made people trust him even when the situation seemed hopeless. Victor had always been different. He did not follow rules blindly. While other doctors worked strictly by the books, he thought about new ways to solve old problems. He read medical reports late at night and experimented quietly in his small laboratory. Some called his methods dangerous. Others whispered that he was reckless. But Victor believed in one thing above all: saving lives. That day the hospital was overflowing. A young soldier named James had been brought in, bleeding heavily from a deep wound in his leg. His uniform was soaked in blood, and his breathing was shallow. Nurses worked to stop the bleeding, but the blood loss was too fast. Victor leaned over him, examining the wound with a calm, steady hand. "Give him more blood," a nurse shouted, panic in her voice. Victor shook his head. "We don't have enough. This method, it won't work fast enough." He looked at the empty blood bags stacked in the corner. Supplies were running out everywhere. He walked to a quiet corner of the room and took out a small notebook. In it were notes he had made over months of thinking and experimenting. Pages were filled with sketches, calculations, and ideas that others might call impossible. His eyes scanned the pages quickly, searching for a solution. Doctors tried everything, but nothing worked. Until one man tried the impossible. Victor paused at a page labeled, "The Forbidden Method." It was an idea no one else had dared to try. If it worked, it could store blood safely for weeks instead of days, allowing him to save soldiers like James. But it was risky. If he failed, the consequences could be terrible, not just for him but for the soldiers depending on him. He closed his notebook and looked around the hospital. Another wounded soldier screamed in pain. Another nurse fainted from exhaustion. Victor felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Every second counted. Every drop of blood mattered. And yet he knew he had to take the risk. Outside, the sounds of battle continued: gunfire, explosions, and the shouts of men fighting for their lives. Inside, the hospital felt like a small island of desperation in a sea of death. Victor's mind raced. How could he take a forbidden idea and make it work? How could he store blood safely when the world said it was impossible? He thought of the soldiers who had already died that week. Young men who had families, dreams, and hopes, gone because there was no blood to save them. He could not let that happen again. Not if there was a way, even a dangerous one, to prevent it. Victor's hand hovered over the notebook. He knew that some people would call him a rule breaker, a rebel, or even a fool. But he also knew that courage often meant standing alone. The battlefield outside was cruel and unforgiving, but the real fight, he realized, was here, in the quiet of the hospital, against time, against death itself. As he opened the notebook again, he whispered to himself, "If this works, we can save them all." And in that moment, the seed of hope was planted. A forbidden idea that could change the course of the war. A secret method that could save tens of thousands of lives. Victor had no way of knowing if it would succeed, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to try. The hospital fell silent for a brief moment, as if the world itself held its breath. Outside, the war raged on. Inside, a single man dared to think differently. And that difference could change everything. The night was quiet outside the hospital, but inside, Victor Harlan's mind raced like the battlefield he had left hours ago. The screams and explosions had faded, replaced by the steady drip of IVs and the soft moans of the wounded. But the war was far from over, not for the soldiers and certainly not for him. Victor returned to his small, dimly lit laboratory, a room stacked with glass bottles, test tubes, and medical papers. The faint smell of chemicals hung in the air. He opened his notebook again, the pages filled with his sketches and calculations. His eyes scanned the words he had written over months of careful thought. The forbidden method, he whispered to himself, his finger tracing the lines of a diagram that could save thousands of lives, or ruin him completely. The method was unlike anything the world had tried before. Blood could only survive for a few days outside the human body, and in wartime fresh blood was always in short supply. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and soldiers were dying because the medicine and supplies could not reach them in time. Victor's idea was bold. A way to store blood safely for weeks using a mixture of chemicals and temperature control, something no other doctor had dared to attempt. He paused. The plan was dangerous. Even the smallest mistake could destroy the blood, make it useless, or worse, harm the patient. Military authorities would never approve it. Colleagues would call him reckless. Yet Victor knew he had no choice. Every day, soldiers like James, the young man he had tried to save yesterday, were dying because no one had dared to try something new. He remembered the scene in the hospital, a young soldier's eyes staring at him, fear and hope tangled together. That look haunted Victor. He had promised himself he would find a way to save them. And now, in the quiet of the night, he was ready to risk everything. Victor began preparing. He carefully measured chemicals, adjusted the temperature controls, and worked methodically. Each step required precision. One miscalculation could be fatal. He worked slowly, checking and rechecking every detail. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a faint explosion reminded him that the war never truly stopped. Hours passed. Victor felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a heavy stone. Sweat formed on his brow as he watched the blood in the glass containers. It glowed faintly under the lamp, like a promise or a warning. He spoke quietly to himself, a ritual to keep his mind focused. This has to work, it must. The first test was simple. A small amount of blood taken from a volunteer soldier who had already donated before. Victor carefully placed it into the container, added the chemical mixture, and activated the temperature control. For a moment nothing happened. Then, slowly, the blood stabilized. It looked the same as when it had been taken, fresh and ready. Victor's heart raced. It was a small success, but enough to prove that his method had potential. But the real challenge was much larger. Storing a few pints of blood in a laboratory was one thing. Doing it on the battlefield, under pressure, with limited supplies, was another. Victor knew that the next step could not wait. Soldiers were dying every hour. The method had to be tested where it mattered most. He made a decision. The next day he would take his method to the front lines. He would show the world, or at least the army, that it could work. But the thought of failure lingered like a shadow. What if the blood spoiled? What if a soldier died because of him? The idea of being blamed for deaths haunted him, but Victor pushed it aside. Fear was a luxury he could not afford. Victor also knew that secrecy was crucial. If word got out about his method before it worked, authorities might shut him down, call him reckless, or worse, punish him for breaking medical rules. So he worked alone, carefully covering his tracks, labeling the containers with code names, and keeping his notes hidden. The forbidden idea was now a secret that could save lives or destroy his career. As the night deepened, Victor sat back in his chair, exhausted but determined. He looked at the blood containers, glowing softly in the dim light. Each one represented hope, a chance to save a life, maybe dozens, maybe hundreds. His mind wandered to the young soldiers he had seen today, the ones gasping for help, the ones whose families were waiting back home. He whispered, almost to himself, "I will not let you die." For hours he worked, making adjustments, taking careful notes, imagining how he would use the method in the chaos of war. The forbidden idea was no longer just a theory, it was becoming a lifeline. But he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The battlefield was unpredictable. Soldiers were dying every second. And soon Victor would have to put his secret method to the ultimate test, where failure could mean disaster. Finally, as dawn approached, he packed the carefully prepared blood containers into insulated cases. His hands shook with exhaustion, but also with anticipation. Today the forbidden idea would leave the laboratory. Today it would meet the battlefield. Victor paused at the door, taking a deep breath. Outside, the sun began to rise over a war-torn landscape, painting the smoke and rubble in a pale gold. Somewhere out there, soldiers were waiting, unaware that one man had dared to challenge the impossible. One man's courage, one forbidden idea, could change the course of the war. And Victor Harlan knew it. The sun was barely rising when Victor Harlan arrived at the front lines. Smoke hung low over the battlefield, curling like dark fingers into the sky. The ground was torn apart by shells, mud thick under the soldiers' boots. In the distance, men ran between craters, some carrying the wounded, others shouting orders. The war was relentless, and Victor felt the weight of every life that depended on him. He carried the carefully packed containers of stored blood, each one a promise of hope. Soldiers glanced at him with suspicion and curiosity. Who was this quiet doctor, walking calmly into chaos while others ran for cover? Victor ignored the whispers. Today was not about recognition, it was about saving lives. Inside a makeshift field hospital near the front, the scene was as desperate as ever. Soldiers with torn uniforms and deep wounds lay on rough stretchers. Nurses and medics moved frantically, but the supply of fresh blood was already gone. Some soldiers gasped weakly, their faces pale and eyes distant. Time was slipping away faster than help could reach them. Victor opened the first container, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. He examined the blood carefully, it looked perfect just as it had in his laboratory. He filled a syringe, then carefully approached a wounded soldier. The man had been hit in the chest, blood flowing rapidly from a deep wound. "Hold still," Victor said calmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. The soldier's eyes widened with fear, but he obeyed. Victor inserted the needle and began the transfusion. Minutes felt like hours. The nurses watched, tense. Soldiers nearby held their breath. The moment was critical. If the blood did not work, the soldier could die instantly. Slowly, color began to return to the soldier's face. His breathing steadied. His eyes, which had seemed ready to close forever, blinked and focused. Murmurs ran through the room. A nurse whispered, "It's working?" Victor did not smile. He had seen hope before, only to watch it vanish. He knew the test was not over. There were dozens more like this young man, and every drop counted. As the day went on, Victor moved from one wounded soldier to another. The forbidden blood method was working, but the challenges were immense. Containers were heavy, the temperature controls fragile, and the supplies limited. He had to work quickly, carefully, and constantly. Every mistake could be fatal. Outside, the sounds of battle raged on. Explosions shook the hospital walls, and stray bullets whistled dangerously close. Soldiers screamed in the distance, some wounded, some lost forever. Victor's focus never wavered. Each time a soldier survived, he felt a flicker of hope, but it was always mixed with fear. The battlefield was unpredictable, and no method, no matter how clever, was guaranteed to succeed. By midday, word of the doctor's unusual method began to spread. Soldiers whispered about the quiet man saving lives with blood that seemed to last forever. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with awe. Military officers peeked through the hospital's makeshift doors, curious and concerned. The forbidden idea was no longer just a secret in the laboratory, it was being tested in the most dangerous place possible. Victor noticed a young soldier struggling to breathe. The man had been hit by shrapnel and had already lost a dangerous amount of blood. Victor acted quickly, taking a container from the case and preparing the transfusion. The soldier's eyes met his, filled with fear and hope. "This will help," Victor said softly. "Stay with me." The transfusion began. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The nurse bit her lip, fearing the worst. But slowly, the man's color returned, his breathing grew steadier, and a weak but real smile appeared on his face. Around them, others began to notice. A sense of disbelief and wonder spread through the hospital. Yet Victor remained cautious. This was only the first test. There were hundreds more soldiers in need, and he knew the battlefield would not wait. He moved to the next patient, then the next, each transfusion a race against time. By evening, Victor was exhausted, his hands shaking but his spirit relentless. He stepped outside for a brief moment, looking at the battlefield bathed in the dim glow of sunset. He saw soldiers limping back to camp, some waving weakly in thanks. But he also saw the wounded still lying in craters, still waiting for help. The first test had worked, but the war had not ended, and neither had the danger. Victor knew the forbidden idea had potential, but now it had to survive scrutiny, supply shortages, and the relentless chaos of battle. And most of all, it had to save enough lives to prove that one man's courage could challenge the rules of medicine, and maybe even change the course of the war. As night fell, Victor returned to the hospital. The faint glow of lamps illuminated the tired faces of the soldiers and nurses. He looked at the containers of blood, some empty, some still full. Each one represented hope, each one a challenge yet to come. He whispered to himself, "We're just getting started. We have so much more to do." Outside, the war raged on. Inside, a single man's forbidden idea had survived its first trial. The world did not know it yet, but Victor Harlan's courage, and his dangerous, brilliant plan, was about to make history. The morning after the first successful tests, Victor Harlan knew the danger had grown. His forbidden method had worked, saving dozens of soldiers, but now it had attracted attention. Word of the miracle doctor spread quickly through the camps. Soldiers whispered stories of the quiet man who could keep blood alive for days, even weeks. Some called him a genius. Others feared he had broken every rule in the medical book. It was only a matter of time before the higher authorities noticed. By mid-morning, 2 senior military doctors arrived at the field hospital. Their expressions were stern, eyes cold with suspicion. They had heard rumors of this secret method, and came to investigate. "Dr. Harlan?" one of them asked, his voice sharp. "We've heard reports that you've been storing blood outside approved protocols. Is this true?" Victor remained calm. "Yes," he said simply. "It's a new method. It works." The men exchanged glances. One scoffed. "This could be dangerous. You know the regulations. Unauthorized methods are not allowed. If anything goes wrong, people could die. You could be held responsible." Victor did not flinch. "People are already dying," he said quietly. "I'm trying to save them. This method is the only way to do it." For a moment, silence filled the room. Outside, distant explosions reminded everyone that the war continued, and every minute counted. One of the senior doctors leaned closer. "You understand the risk? If this fails, not only could you lose your license, you could be court-martialed." Victor met their gaze steadily. "If we do nothing, more soldiers will die. I cannot stand by and watch it happen." The officers left shortly after, muttering about regulations and risks. Victor knew their skepticism was far from over. They would be watching, waiting for a reason to stop him. The forbidden method, once a quiet experiment in a lab, was now a target. Every success had also made him a potential enemy. As Victor returned to the hospital wards, he saw soldiers recovering, color returning to their faces. Their gratitude was quiet but powerful. Each life saved was proof that he was right, but proof meant nothing to the authorities who feared breaking rules. Later that day, a new threat appeared. Reports came in that enemy scouts had captured rumors of a miracle doctor on the battlefield. Victor's method, still secret in its details, was now a target for spies. If the wrong people learned about it, the enemy could try to sabotage his efforts or use the idea for their own gain. Victor realized the stakes were higher than ever. Not only did he have to fight the rules, but he also had to protect his method from those who would misuse it. He began to work more cautiously, moving containers of blood to hidden locations and labeling them in code. He could not trust anyone completely, not even some of his own staff in case information leaked. Despite the danger, Victor continued. Soldiers were still dying without enough blood, and he refused to stop. Each transfusion was a small victory, but every success also increased scrutiny. He began to train a few trusted nurses to use the method quickly and carefully. They became his secret team, helping him administer blood to those in most urgent need. But the tension was growing. Military superiors visited more often, questioning his methods and testing his results. Some were impressed, but others were openly hostile, criticizing him for breaking protocol. Victor faced whispers, threats, and disapproval, yet he never hesitated in his mission. He had seen the faces of the young soldiers he saved, and that gave him courage. One afternoon, during a major wave of casualties, an officer approached him in anger. "Harlan, I warned you. You cannot continue like this. This is against every regulation." Victor looked at the wounded soldiers in the room. Their breathing was shallow, their bodies pale from blood loss. "I warned you," he said quietly. "If we do nothing, they die. This works. I will not stop." The officer's face hardened, but before he could argue further, Victor moved quickly to assist a critically wounded soldier. The transfusion was urgent. The officer watched, silent, as color returned to the man's face. For the first time he said nothing. Perhaps he understood, perhaps he feared testing Victor further. Victor knew this was only temporary. Challenges were coming. More wounded, limited supplies, more officials questioning him. The forbidden method had survived the battlefield, but survival alone was not enough. He needed to prove it could save thousands of lives, and fast. That night, Victor sat alone in the quiet of the field hospital. The hum of the lanterns was the only sound. Outside, distant explosions punctuated the darkness, a reminder that the war was far from over. He thought of the soldiers he could still save, of the risks he faced, and of the enemy watching from afar. Every decision mattered. One mistake could ruin everything. But Victor's resolve was unwavering. The forbidden idea, dangerous and controversial, had already changed lives. And he knew that he could not let rules, fear, or enemies stop him. The war was cruel, but his courage, and his secret method, was becoming stronger than the fear around it. As he closed his eyes briefly, he whispered to himself, "They may try to stop me, but the soldiers must live. I will find a way." The first challenge with the authorities had passed, but the war, the skeptics, and the enemy had not. Victor Harlan's fight had just begun, and the next battles would test not only his forbidden idea but his very courage. His next battle arrived with a roar. Artillery shells ripped through the earth, sending plumes of smoke high into the sky. Soldiers ran across mud-strewn fields, dodging bullets and craters, dragging their wounded comrades to safety. The front lines were chaos, blood, fire, and fear intertwined in a deadly dance. Victor Harlan arrived with his team, carrying the precious containers of stored blood. This time the stakes were higher than ever. Hundreds of soldiers were arriving at the field hospital, many critically injured, many already close to death from blood loss. Victor could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like never before. This was no longer a small test, it was a trial by fire. If his method failed now, countless lives would be lost. Victor moved quickly, assessing each soldier. Nurses followed his instructions with practiced efficiency, drawing blood from the containers and preparing transfusions. Every second counted. The first soldier, a young man with a chest wound, had already lost too much blood. Victor inserted the needle and began the transfusion. His eyes never left the patient's face. Minutes passed like hours. The young soldier's breathing was shallow, his body trembling. Then, slowly, color returned to his pale cheeks. His grip on life tightened and his eyes opened, alert and focused. A nurse gasped softly. "It's working, it's really working." Victor allowed himself a brief nod, but he knew the battle was far from over. Hundreds more were waiting, many worse than the first. The blood supply was limited, and every container had to be used carefully. Mistakes were not allowed. Outside the hospital, the battle raged. Shells exploded nearby, and cries of wounded soldiers pierced the air. Victor could see the fear and exhaustion in every face around him. Some officers still doubted him, but others had begun to recognize the impossible. His forbidden method was saving lives that should have been lost. Hours passed. The hospital became a whirlwind of motion. Victor directing transfusions, nurses moving at lightning speed, wounded soldiers arriving in endless waves. Each successful transfusion built hope, but each new arrival reminded him of the limits. Supplies could run out at any moment. A sudden alert came. A group of critically wounded soldiers had been trapped under heavy fire near the front line. Victor knew they wouldn't survive long without immediate blood transfusions. Without hesitation, he organized a small team and moved out to the battlefield, carrying the containers himself. The scene was worse than he imagined. Soldiers lay in craters, bleeding, their uniforms shredded. Explosions sent mud and debris flying. Victor and his team moved carefully, setting up a temporary station amid the chaos. The first wounded man was barely conscious, gasping for breath. Victor inserted the transfusion, holding the patient's hand, whispering reassurance. Color slowly returned, strength returning in small increments. One by one, more soldiers were treated. Victor's method worked, again. But each success came with a cost. The team had to stay alert constantly. The enemy fire could strike at any moment. One wrong move could kill them all. As the day wore on, Victor realized something extraordinary. His forbidden method was not just saving lives, it was changing the tide of the battle. Soldiers who would have died were now strong enough to return to the fight. His courage and innovation were giving the army a second chance, a chance that no one thought possible. Despite the exhaustion, Victor did not pause. He moved from patient to patient, guiding his team, improvising when supplies ran low, always keeping the focus on saving lives. Around him, a quiet determination spread among the soldiers and nurses. They saw that the impossible was real. By evening, the field hospital was filled with recovering soldiers. Their faces, once pale and hopeless, now showed the faint glow of life returning. Officers who had doubted Victor stood silently, witnessing what they could not deny. The forbidden method had proven itself under the most extreme conditions. Victor stepped outside briefly, looking at the battlefield in the fading light. The war was still raging, but hope had returned to the men he had saved. For the first time he felt the power of his idea, not just as a secret experiment but as a force that could change the course of the war. Yet even in victory, danger remained. He knew authorities would question him further, the enemy was still aware of rumors and supplies were always limited. The forbidden method had turned the tide, but the war was far from over. Victor's courage and determination would be tested again, perhaps in ways he could not imagine. As night fell, he returned to the hospital, exhausted but resolute. The soldiers slept, finally safe for the night, their lives preserved by a single man's daring and ingenuity. Victor looked at the containers of blood, now fewer but still glowing softly. Each one represented hope, courage, and the power to defy the impossible. He whispered quietly, almost to himself, "We've done it today, but tomorrow the real test begins." The battlefield had survived the day. So had Victor Harlan. And the world was beginning to realize that one man's forbidden idea could change everything. By the time dawn broke over the battlefield, the scale of Victor Harlan's achievement was becoming clear. Soldiers who had been near death now walked and spoke, their faces showing a fragile but undeniable glow of life. The forbidden method, once a secret experiment in a quiet laboratory, had become a lifeline for hundreds, even thousands. Word spread quickly, through whispers among soldiers, through letters to families, and through cautious reports to headquarters. Military officers arrived in the field hospital, eyes wide with disbelief. They had heard rumors of Victor's secret method, but seeing it in action was another matter entirely. Soldiers were alive who should have been lost. Wounded men who had barely clung to life had recovered enough to fight or return to their units. Every container of blood was precious, and every successful transfusion was proof that Victor's idea was more than a gamble, it was a miracle. One officer approached Victor, his expression a mixture of shock and respect. "Dr. Harlan, I don't understand. How is this possible? The blood, it's working. They're alive." Victor remained calm, though inside he felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. "It's a method I've been developing," he said simply. "It's dangerous but it works. It can save many lives if we use it carefully." The officer nodded slowly, still unable to fully comprehend what he was seeing. "You've saved countless soldiers today, perhaps tens of thousands. This changes everything." Victor felt the weight of the words. Tens of thousands of lives. Families reunited, letters written, futures preserved. The numbers were staggering, almost beyond belief. Yet he did not let the praise distract him. He knew there were still challenges ahead. Supplies were limited, the war raged on, and enemies were always lurking. Every decision mattered. But the most astonishing reaction came from the doctors who had once doubted him. They examined the blood containers, checking the method, verifying the results. Their skepticism gave way to wonder. One of the senior doctors muttered under his breath, "I've never seen anything like this. It's impossible." Victor simply nodded. "It's not impossible," he said quietly. "It's just untested. And now it's proven." News of the miracle blood began to reach other parts of the army. Soldiers whispered stories to one another about the quiet man who had defied the rules and saved lives no one thought could survive. Even the enemy, through intercepted reports, began to take notice, though they did not yet understand the method. Victor's courage had not only saved soldiers, it had begun to shift the perception of what could be achieved in wartime medicine. The emotional impact was profound. Soldiers wrote letters home, describing the doctor who had given them a second chance at life. Nurses wept quietly as they recounted the transformations they had witnessed. Families sent gifts and messages of gratitude. In every corner of the field hospital, hope had replaced despair, and the atmosphere pulsed with the quiet triumph of survival. Despite the acclaim, Victor remained humble. He moved among the soldiers, checking on their recovery, answering questions, and quietly giving instructions to his team. He knew the method had worked, but he also understood that the war was not yet won. Every saved life was precious, but there were still more lives to protect, more battles to face, and more challenges to overcome. That evening, as the sun set over the battlefield, Victor allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought of the countless soldiers whose lives had been saved, of the families who would now know their loved ones were alive, and of the power of a single idea to change the course of history. His forbidden method, once hidden and doubted, had proven itself beyond question. But even in triumph, danger lingered. Authorities still monitored his work, the enemy remained unpredictable, and the logistics of war meant that every success required careful planning. Victor knew that one misstep could undo everything he had accomplished. Yet he also knew that courage, determination, and ingenuity had carried him this far, and they would carry him further. In the quiet of the night, Victor walked among the recovering soldiers. Their eyes met his, filled with gratitude, hope, and something more, trust. He had not just given them life. He had given them a reason to keep fighting, a reason to believe that humanity could survive even the most brutal circumstances. He paused by a small window looking out at the battlefield. Smoke still rose in the distance, the sound of artillery echoing faintly through the air. But inside the hospital life had returned. The forbidden idea, once a secret, had become a symbol of hope and courage. And Victor Harlan, the quiet man who dared to defy the rules, had proven that one person could indeed change the fate of thousands. As he closed his eyes briefly, Victor whispered to himself, "We've saved them, but the world will never forget this. Not now. Not ever." The secret had been revealed. The forbidden method was no longer just an experiment. It was a miracle that had altered the course of the war, and history would remember the quiet doctor who had dared to believe the impossible was possible. The war had finally ended. The roar of artillery and the cries of soldiers were replaced by a tense, quiet peace. Fields once torn apart by explosions were now scarred, silent reminders of the conflict that had claimed so many lives. For Victor Harlan, the battles of the past years still lingered, not the fighting of soldiers, but the struggle to save lives when hope seemed impossible. Victor returned to a world that had barely noticed his sacrifice. His forbidden method had saved tens of thousands of soldiers, yet recognition came slowly. While medals and honors were being handed to some officers, Victor's name remained largely unknown outside the hospitals and the small circle of nurses and soldiers who had seen his courage firsthand. He did not mind. Victor had never sought fame. He had only wanted to save lives, to give young men and women a chance to return home. And in that, he had succeeded beyond measure. Soldiers he had saved returned to visit him quietly, letters in hand, families expressing gratitude that could not be measured in words. They called him a hero, though Victor only smiled modestly, refusing to take the spotlight. Years later, as the world rebuilt, Victor's method became known to the wider medical community. Scientists and doctors studied his work, amazed at the brilliance of a single mind that had dared to challenge the rules for the sake of life. Hospitals around the world began using his techniques, and countless more lives were saved because one man had refused to accept the limits of possibility. Victor watched quietly as history began to acknowledge his work. He never sought it, yet it came. Scholars wrote about him, newspapers told the story of the miracle doctor, and soldiers who had survived returned to thank the man who had given them a second chance. Each story, each letter, each visit reminded Victor of the lives he had touched and the risk he had taken. But for Victor, the most meaningful recognition came not from awards or titles, but from the soldiers themselves. He remembered James, the young man from the first transfusion, whose face had haunted Victor with fear and hope. He remembered hundreds of others, each with a story of survival. For Victor, these were the true victories: the lives saved, the families kept whole, the hope restored in a world that had once known only despair. Even as years passed, Victor remained humble. He continued to study medicine quietly, mentoring young doctors and sharing his knowledge with those willing to learn. His forbidden idea, once a secret that could have ruined him, became a foundation for modern medical practices. Hospitals used his techniques during peacetime and future conflicts alike, honoring the courage that had created them. Victor's health faded slowly with age, but his mind remained sharp. He often walked through hospitals, observing patients and doctors, reflecting on a life that had been filled with danger, challenge, and purpose. He understood that courage was not measured by medals or applause, but by the willingness to act when others hesitated, by the choice to save life even when the odds were against you. One evening, as the sun set over a peaceful city, Victor sat by a window watching children play in the streets. He thought of the countless soldiers who had survived because of him, the families who had been spared grief, and the young doctors who would carry his methods forward. A quiet smile formed on his face. He had faced rules, danger, and doubt, and had won not for glory but for life itself. In the small quiet moments he reflected on the journey. From the battlefield chaos, the first dangerous transfusions, the scrutiny of authorities and the fear of enemy spies, to the miraculous recovery of thousands, every step had been perilous. Yet it had led to something extraordinary. Proof that one person's courage, ingenuity, and refusal to accept limits could change history. As night fell, Victor whispered softly, almost to himself, "I did what I had to do. They live, and that is enough." The world would remember him. Not only for the forbidden method that had saved tens of thousands, but for the example he had set, showing that courage, intelligence, and determination could defy even the most impossible odds. And in the hearts of those who lived, in the families who rejoiced, in the soldiers who survived, Victor Harlan's legacy endured. A quiet hero, a man who had dared to challenge the rules, a doctor whose single idea had saved a world. History would never forget the courage of one man who refused to accept death as the only option. And through his actions humanity learned a simple but powerful truth. That even in the darkest times one person's determination could light the way and change the fate of thousands.